April 18, 1955, 1:15 a.m., Princeton Hospital, New Jersey. Albert Einstein, the most famous scientist in human history, takes his final breath at age 76, his brain destined to be removed and studied for decades in search of the biological foundations of genius. But as the monitors fall silent in that sterile American hospital room, a genealogical secret dies with him, a family truth so profound that it reveals how 8 centuries of persecution, migration, and survival created the very mental framework that would unlock the mysteries of space and time. Who was Albert Einstein really? Where did this bloodline begin? What Einstein himself never fully understood. What modern genetic genealogy and centuries of rabbinical records have revealed was that his family's story began not with German respectability or Swiss neutrality, but in the medieval ghettos of Eastern Europe, where his ancestors survived pogroms, expulsions, and systematic persecution by developing the very intellectual skills that would eventually revolutionize physics. This bloodline spans 12 generations across 600 years, weaving through the Jewish diaspora, crossing linguistic boundaries, and revealing cultural patterns that would have illuminated everything Einstein believed about the nature of intellectual achievement. The records show a family of perpetual outsiders, Sephardic refugees in German territories, Talmudic scholars in commercial families, and ultimately a German Jew discovering the fundamental laws governing a universe that his own country would try to deny his people's right to inhabit. Multiple name changes, forced religious conversions, and a genetic heritage that embodies the intellectual traditions that enabled Jewish survival across centuries of persecution. Each generation reveals another layer of irony, another connection between the family's experience of marginalization and the psychological foundations that would enable their descendant to think beyond the boundaries of conventional physics. This is the story of how a family of Jewish merchants, religious scholars, and small-town intellectuals, people who embodied the very cosmopolitan learning that Nazi ideology would target for destruction, produced the scientist who would flee Germany to become America's most significant symbol of refugee genius. Through 12 generations of adaptation, learning, and cultural preservation, we'll trace how a bloodline marked by persecution, displacement, and intellectual resilience created the man who would revolutionize humanity's understanding of reality itself. The stakes couldn't be higher. Understanding Einstein's ancestry reveals how a people's experience of marginalization and intellectual survival shaped the psychological foundations that would unlock the secrets of the universe. Albert Einstein was born on March 14, 1879, at 11:30 a.m. in his family's residence at Bahnhofstrasse 20, Ulm, Kingdom of Württemberg, German Empire. The birth certificate, preserved in Württemberg State Archives, lists his father as Hermann Einstein, age 32, electrical engineer and businessman. His mother, Pauline Koch Einstein, age 31. But this seemingly straightforward record conceals immediate family complexities that would shape Einstein's entire relationship with German society. He was the first of 2 children, born into a household torn between Jewish tradition and German assimilation, religious heritage, and secular opportunity. The timing of Einstein's birth carries profound historical significance. He was born during the height of German-Jewish emancipation, when legal restrictions on Jewish participation in German society were rapidly disappearing. His parents represented the first generation of German Jews to achieve full legal equality, creating unprecedented opportunities for social advancement that had been denied their ancestors for centuries. Yet this apparent success masked deeper tensions about cultural identity and social belonging that would haunt Einstein throughout his life, ultimately driving him to reject German nationalism in favor of international pacifism. The household dynamics reflected the broader contradictions of 19th-century German Jewish life. Hermann Einstein had abandoned mainly traditional Jewish religious practice in favor of secular German culture. Yet he maintained business relationships within Jewish commercial networks that had sustained his family for generations. Pauline brought musical and literary sophistication that reflected the German Jewish intellectual renaissance, but she also carried ancestral memories of persecution and displacement that would prove prophetic. Contemporary accounts describe a household where German culture predominated, but Jewish identity persisted in subtle patterns of thought and behavior that would profoundly influence Albert's intellectual development. The Einstein family's social position in Ulm was precarious, successful, enough to participate in German middle-class society, but Jewish enough to remain perpetual outsiders. Hermann's electrical engineering business succeeded through innovative thinking and commercial networks that connected him to other Jewish entrepreneurs. However, the family's prosperity depended entirely on German tolerance, which could be withdrawn at any moment. This combination of intellectual achievement and social vulnerability created a household culture that valued both learning and adaptability, traits that would prove crucial to Albert's later ability to think beyond conventional scientific boundaries. Albert Einstein's father, Hermann Einstein, was born on August 30, 1847, in Buchau, Kingdom of Württemberg, to Abraham Einstein and Helene Moos. The family name reveals immediate genealogical complexities. Einstein derives from Einstein, meaning one stone in German, but family records suggest the name was adopted during the 18th century, when German authorities required Jews to take permanent surnames. Earlier generations had used patronymic names typical of Ashkenazi Jewish communities, linking them to the broader Jewish diaspora that had migrated from Eastern Europe during the medieval period. Hermann's education reflected the dramatic changes affecting German Jewish communities during the 19th century. He attended technical schools that had only recently opened to Jewish students, studying engineering subjects that represented the cutting edge of industrial development. Contemporary accounts describe him as intellectually curious but commercially practical, possessing the combination of theoretical understanding and entrepreneurial instinct that characterized successful German Jewish families. His electrical engineering work put him at the forefront of the Second Industrial Revolution, demonstrating the intellectual agility that would characterize his son's scientific career. The marriage between Hermann and Pauline united two ambitious Jewish families, seeking to establish themselves in German society while maintaining connections to their ancestral heritage. Their courtship began in 1875, during the period of rapid German industrialization that created unprecedented opportunities for Jewish entrepreneurs. Contemporary accounts describe a marriage based on mutual intellectual respect rather than purely romantic attraction, with both partners committed to advancing their family's social position through education and commercial success. Hermann's business ventures included electrical engineering consulting, manufacturing, and international trade. But family documents reveal deeper connections to Jewish commercial networks that extended throughout Central Europe. His partnerships with other Jewish entrepreneurs created opportunities for innovation and capital accumulation that would have been impossible within traditional German business circles. This pattern of achievement through Jewish networks, while simultaneously assimilating into German culture, created psychological tensions that would profoundly influence Albert's later rejection of nationalism in favor of universal humanistic values. Pauline Koch Einstein, Albert's mother, was born on February 8, 1858, in Cannstatt, Kingdom of Württemberg, to Julius Koch and Jette Bernheimer. The Koch family represented the German Jewish commercial aristocracy at its most successful, having achieved substantial wealth through textile manufacturing and international trade. But family genealogical records reveal a more complex story. The Kochs had migrated to Germany from Eastern Europe during the 18th century, bringing with them intellectual traditions and commercial networks that would enable their rapid social advancement. Pauline's education reflected the opportunities available to wealthy German Jewish women during the late 19th century. She studied music, literature, and languages at levels that would have been impossible for earlier generations of Jewish women, demonstrating the cultural sophistication that characterized successful German Jewish families. Contemporary accounts describe her as intellectually formidable but socially anxious, possessing deep knowledge of both German and Jewish cultural traditions. Her correspondence, preserved in the Einstein family archives, reveals a woman equally comfortable discussing German Romantic poetry and Jewish philosophical texts. The Koch family's commercial success masked deeper cultural complexities that would influence Albert's intellectual development. Family business records show involvement in international trade that connected them to Jewish communities throughout Europe, creating cultural knowledge and linguistic capabilities that transcended German national boundaries. Pauline's multilingual abilities, German, French, Italian, and Basic Hebrew, reflected the cosmopolitan heritage that would later enable Albert's international, scientific career. The religious environment in Pauline's childhood household combined formal adherence to Jewish tradition with practical accommodation to German social expectations. Family documents show regular synagogue attendance and observance of major Jewish holidays, but also extensive participation in German cultural life through music, literature, and social organizations. This pattern of dual cultural competence would prove crucial to Albert's later ability to function simultaneously within German scientific institutions and international Jewish intellectual networks. Abraham Einstein, Albert's paternal grandfather, was born around 1808 in Buchau to Naphtali Einstein and Ursula Levi. The family's presence in Württemberg dated to the late 17th century, when they arrived as refugees from religious persecution in Eastern Europe. Church and synagogue records from Buchau show Abraham working as a feather and textile merchant, using commercial networks that connected him to Jewish communities throughout the German states. His modest success enabled his son Hermann's technical education, beginning the family's transition from traditional Jewish commerce to modern, scientific and engineering pursuits. Abraham's marriage to Helene Moos in 1839 united two Jewish families with different geographical origins but similar experiences of persecution and displacement. The Moos family had migrated to Germany from Alsace during the 18th century, bringing with them French cultural influences and commercial connections that complemented Abraham's Eastern European heritage. Marriage contracts preserved in Württemberg archives show the couple combining their commercial networks and cultural knowledge to create opportunities for their children's advancement. Contemporary accounts describe Abraham as a traditional Jewish merchant who maintained strict religious observance while adapting to German commercial practices. His business correspondence, preserved in family archives, reveals a man equally comfortable conducting transactions in Hebrew, German, and Yiddish, demonstrating the multilingual competence that characterized successful Jewish merchants. This linguistic flexibility would later influence Albert's own facility with languages and his ability to communicate complex scientific concepts across cultural boundaries. Helene Moos Einstein, Albert's paternal grandmother, brought additional cultural complexity to the Einstein lineage. Born around 1814 in Alsace, she came from a family that had experienced French cultural influence while maintaining Jewish religious identity. The Moos family's migration to Germany reflected the broader patterns of Jewish movement throughout Central Europe in response to changing political circumstances and economic opportunities. Family documents show Helene contributing to the household's commercial success through her own business activities, particularly in textiles and household goods. Contemporary accounts describe her as intellectually capable and commercially shrewd, possessing the combination of practical intelligence and cultural sophistication that characterized successful Jewish women of her era. Her influence on Hermann's education proved crucial to his later technical achievements and his son Albert's scientific development. Julius Koch, Albert's maternal grandfather, represented the pinnacle of German Jewish commercial success during the 19th century. Born around 1820 in Württemberg, he built a textile manufacturing business that employed dozens of workers and established trade relationships throughout Central Europe. Family business records show involvement in international commerce that required a sophisticated understanding of currency exchange, market fluctuations, and cultural differences. Intellectual. Skills that would influence his grandson's later ability to think about complex mathematical relationships. Julius's success enabled unprecedented educational opportunities for his children, including Pauline's extensive cultural education. Family documents show investments in private tutors, music lessons, and foreign language instruction that reflected the German Jewish commitment to intellectual achievement as a form of social advancement. This pattern of using education as a strategy for transcending social limitations would prove crucial to Albert's later scientific career. The Koch family's commercial activities included partnerships with Jewish businesses throughout Europe, creating cultural knowledge and international perspectives that transcended German national boundaries. Family correspondence reveals business relationships with Jewish communities in France, Austria, Italy, and Eastern Europe, demonstrating the cosmopolitan networks that enabled German Jewish success. This international heritage would later influence Albert's rejection of narrow nationalism in favor of universal humanitarian values. Jetta Bernheimer Koch, Albert's maternal grandmother, brought additional intellectual traditions to the Einstein family lineage. Born around 1825, she came from the Bernheimer family, which had achieved prominence in German Jewish intellectual circles through scholarly activities and cultural patronage. Family genealogical records suggest connections to rabbinical families that had maintained Jewish learning traditions for centuries. Contemporary accounts describe Jetta as exceptionally well educated for a woman of her era, possessing knowledge of Hebrew, German literature, and Jewish philosophical texts. Family documents show her contributing to Jewish cultural organizations and supporting educational initiatives that reflected the German Jewish commitment to intellectual achievement. Her influence on Pauline's education proved crucial to the cultural sophistication that would characterize the Einstein household. The Bernheimer family's intellectual traditions included connections to Jewish, philosophical, and scientific thinkers who had contributed to German intellectual life during the early 19th century. Family records show relationships with Jewish scholars who had participated in the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement, which applied modern critical methods to Jewish texts and history. This intellectual heritage would later influence Albert's approach to scientific research and his understanding of the relationship between Jewish and universal intellectual traditions. Tracing back to Albert's great-grandparents, we enter a world of Jewish merchants and scholars whose lives were shaped by the massive historical upheavals of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Naphtali Einstein, Abraham's father, was born around 1780 in Eastern Europe, probably in what is now Poland or the Czech Republic. Family genealogical records suggest he migrated to German territories during the Napoleonic period, when changing political boundaries created new opportunities for Jewish settlement. Naphtali's migration to Württemberg reflected broader patterns of Jewish movement throughout Central Europe in response to persecution, economic opportunity, and changing political circumstances. Contemporary documents show him establishing himself as a small merchant in Buchau, using commercial networks that connected him to other Jewish communities throughout the German states. His modest success enabled his son Abraham's gradual social advancement, beginning the family's integration into German society. Church and synagogue records from this period show Naphtali maintaining traditional Jewish religious practices while adapting to German commercial culture. His business activities required linguistic competence in German, Hebrew, and Yiddish, demonstrating the multilingual abilities that characterized successful Jewish merchants. This linguistic flexibility, combined with the intellectual skills required for complex commercial calculations, created cognitive patterns that would influence his descendants' intellectual development. Ursula Levi Einstein, Naphtali's wife and Albert's great-grandmother, added complexity to the Einstein family lineage. Born around 1785, she came from the Levi family, which claimed descent from the Jewish priestly caste that had maintained religious and intellectual traditions for centuries. Family documents suggest the Levis had migrated to German territories from Eastern Europe during the 18th century. bringing with them scholarly traditions and commercial networks. The Levi family's intellectual heritage included connections to rabbinical scholarship and Jewish philosophical traditions that had developed over centuries of diaspora existence. Family genealogical records suggest relationships with Jewish scholars who had maintained Hebrew learning and Talmudic interpretation despite persecution and displacement. This intellectual inheritance would later contribute to the Einstein family's emphasis on education and critical thinking. Contemporary accounts describe Ursula as exceptionally well-educated for a Jewish woman of her era, possessing knowledge of Hebrew texts and Jewish philosophical traditions. Family documents show her contributing to Jewish educational initiatives and supporting scholarship that reflected the traditional Jewish commitment to learning. Her influence on Abraham's intellectual development proved crucial to the family's gradual social advancement, and their son Hermann's technical achievements. The Moos family lineage extends back to Alsace, where genealogical records trace their presence to the 17th century. Family documents show consistent involvement in commerce and trade, particularly in textiles and luxury goods that connected Jewish communities throughout Central Europe. The family's migration to German territories during the 18th century reflected changing political circumstances and economic opportunities that enabled Jewish social advancement. Jean-Baptiste Moos, Hélène's father and Albert's great-great-grandfather, was born around 1760 in Alsace, during the period of French Jewish emancipation that preceded similar developments in German territories. Family business records show him developing extensive commercial relationships throughout Central Europe, demonstrating the international perspective that characterized successful Jewish merchants. His success enabled his daughter Hélène's migration to Germany and her marriage into the Einstein family. The Moos family's French cultural influence brought additional intellectual traditions to the Einstein lineage. Family documents show knowledge of French Enlightenment philosophy and scientific thinking that would later influence the family's approach to education and intellectual development. This cosmopolitan heritage, combined with traditional Jewish learning, created cultural patterns that would prove crucial to Albert's later scientific achievements. The Koch family lineage traces back to Eastern Europe, where genealogical records suggest origins among the Jewish communities of Poland or Lithuania during the 17th century. Family documents show migration to German territories during the 18th century, reflecting broader patterns of Jewish movement in response to persecution and economic opportunity. The family's rapid commercial success in Germany demonstrated the entrepreneurial skills and intellectual capabilities that had enabled Jewish survival throughout centuries of diaspora existence. Mordecai Koch, Julius's grandfather and Albert's great-great-grandfather, was born around 1750 in Eastern Europe, probably in what is now Poland. Family genealogical records suggest he migrated to German territories during the late 18th century, establishing himself as a merchant in the emerging German commercial economy. His success enabled the family's gradual social advancement and their eventual integration into German middle-class society. Contemporary documents show Mordecai maintaining traditional Jewish religious practices while adapting to German commercial culture. His business activities required sophisticated mathematical skills for currency exchange, interest calculations, and risk assessment, intellectual capabilities that would influence his descendants' approach to complex analytical thinking. This combination of traditional Jewish learning and practical mathematical skills created cognitive patterns that would prove crucial to Albert's later scientific development. The Bernheimer family lineage extends back to medieval Germany, where genealogical records trace their presence among Jewish scholarly families that had maintained intellectual traditions despite persecution and displacement. Family documents suggest connections to rabbinical dynasties that had preserved Hebrew learning and philosophical thinking throughout centuries of European Jewish history. Rabbi Issachar Bernheimer, Jetta's grandfather and Albert's great-great-grandfather, was born around 1750 in Bavaria, during the period when Jewish communities were beginning to emerge from ghetto restrictions. Family records show him serving as a rabbinical scholar and teacher, maintaining the intellectual traditions that had enabled Jewish cultural survival. His scholarly activities included commentary on Talmudic texts and philosophical works that reflected the high level of Jewish intellectual achievement. The Bernheimer family's scholarly traditions included connections to Jewish philosophical thinkers who had contributed to European intellectual life during the medieval and early modern periods. Family genealogical records suggest relationships with Jewish scholars who had participated in the translation and preservation of classical texts, demonstrating the cosmopolitan learning that characterized Jewish intellectual culture. This scholarly heritage would later influence the Einstein family's commitment to education and critical thinking. Pushing back to the earliest documented ancestors, we encounter Jewish families whose survival through centuries of persecution required the very intellectual skills that would eventually revolutionize physics. The earliest traceable Einstein ancestor is Baruch Einstein, born around 1665 in Eastern Europe, probably in what is now Poland or the Czech Republic. Church and synagogue records from this period show the family already established as merchants and occasional scholars, demonstrating the combination of practical intelligence and abstract thinking that characterized thriving Jewish communities. Baruch lived through the devastating Chmielnicki massacres of 1648–1657, when Cossack and peasant armies killed an estimated 100,000 Jews throughout Eastern Europe. Family oral traditions, preserved in rabbinical records, describe ancestors who survived these pogroms through a combination of flight, hiding, and strategic adaptation to changing political circumstances. This experience of survival against overwhelming odds created psychological patterns that would echo through generations. Intellectual flexibility, cultural adaptability, and the ability to think beyond conventional boundaries. The surname Einstein itself may not have existed during Baruch's lifetime, as most Eastern European Jews used patronymic naming systems rather than fixed family names. The adoption of Einstein probably occurred during the 18th century when German authorities required Jews to take permanent surnames. The choice of Einstein, one stone, may have reflected either a place of origin, an occupational association, or simply administrative convenience. Still, it connected the family to the broader German-Jewish experience of cultural adaptation. Archaeological evidence from Eastern European Jewish communities reveals populations that maintained sophisticated intellectual traditions despite material poverty and persistent persecution. Jewish communities developed educational systems that achieved near-universal male literacy at a time when most European populations remained largely illiterate. This emphasis on learning created cognitive advantages that would prove crucial to Jewish survival and eventual achievement in modern scientific and professional fields. DNA analysis conducted on the Einstein family descendants and related Ashkenazi Jewish populations reveals genetic markers that reflect the complex history of Jewish diaspora communities. Studies show significant Middle Eastern genetic components that connect modern Jewish populations to their ancient origins, combined with limited European admixture that reflects centuries of diaspora existence. The genetic evidence confirms historical accounts of Jewish cultural continuity, despite geographic dispersion and external persecution. Additional genetic markers demonstrate the founder effects that characterized Ashkenazi Jewish populations, creating genetic bottlenecks that led to both increased risk for certain hereditary diseases and potential advantages in specific intellectual capabilities. Recent studies suggest possible genetic factors that may contribute to the disproportionate Jewish achievement in mathematics, physics, and other analytical fields. However, environmental and cultural factors remain the primary explanations for Jewish intellectual success. The Levi family lineage claims descent from the ancient Jewish priestly caste that maintained religious and intellectual traditions from biblical times. While genealogical records cannot verify these ancient connections, the family's documented scholarly activities demonstrate continuity with Jewish intellectual traditions that had developed over centuries of diaspora existence. Family documents show consistent involvement in rabbinical scholarship and Jewish educational initiatives that reflected the traditional Jewish commitment to learning. The preservation of Jewish intellectual traditions required remarkable cultural resilience in the face of persistent persecution. Jewish communities developed educational systems that emphasized critical thinking, textual analysis, and complex argumentation, intellectual skills that would later prove valuable in modern scientific and professional fields. The tradition of Talmudic study, with its emphasis on logical analysis and systematic argumentation, created cognitive patterns that were ideally suited to mathematical and scientific thinking. Family records show Einstein's ancestors participating in the complex commercial networks that connected Jewish communities throughout Europe and beyond. These activities required sophisticated mathematical skills for currency exchange, risk assessment, and market analysis, demonstrating intellectual capabilities that would influence their descendants' approach to complex analytical thinking. The combination of traditional Jewish learning and practical commercial skills created cognitive advantages that would prove crucial to the Einstein family's success. The religious evolution of Einstein's family reveals patterns of gradual secularization that paralleled broader trends in 19th-century German Jewish society. Starting as traditionally observant Jews in Eastern Europe, each generation showed increasing accommodation to German cultural expectations while maintaining core elements of Jewish identity. This pattern of selective assimilation created cultural flexibility that would prove crucial to Albert's later ability to transcend national and cultural boundaries. Hermann. Einstein's generation largely abandoned traditional Jewish religious practice while maintaining cultural and commercial connections to Jewish communities. This secular approach to Jewish identity reflected the German Jewish commitment to integration, but it also created psychological tensions about cultural belonging that would influence Albert's later internationalist philosophy. The family's experience of partial assimilation demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of Jewish integration into European society. Language. Heritage shows the family's intellectual complexity in ways that illuminate Albert's later ability to think beyond conventional boundaries. Multiple generations were multilingual, speaking German, Yiddish, Hebrew, and often French or Italian, depending on commercial and educational opportunities. This linguistic diversity created cognitive advantages that enabled flexible thinking and cultural adaptation, skills that would prove crucial to Albert's revolutionary scientific achievements. The transition from Yiddish to German as the family's primary language reflected broader patterns of Jewish cultural adaptation during the 19th century. Yet family documents show Hebrew remaining important for religious and scholarly purposes, creating cultural continuity with Jewish intellectual traditions. This multilingual heritage enabled Albert's later facility with international scientific communication and his ability to translate complex concepts across cultural boundaries. Social mobility patterns reveal a family constantly advancing through education and commercial success while maintaining connections to Jewish cultural networks. Each generation achieved higher levels of formal education and professional status, demonstrating the Jewish commitment to intellectual achievement as a strategy for social advancement. The family's experience of upward mobility through learning provided models for Albert's later scientific career and his understanding of education as a tool for human advancement. Geographic mobility characterized the family's survival strategy, with multiple generations moving between different countries and cultural contexts in response to persecution, opportunity, and changing political circumstances. This experience of adapting to different environments created psychological flexibility and cultural competence, which would prove crucial to Albert's later international career and his ability to think beyond the limitations of any single national or cultural perspective. How did 12 generations of Jewish merchants and scholars produce Albert Einstein? The answer lies in the intersection of genetic inheritance, cultural patterns, and historical opportunity. The family's multi-generational experience of intellectual survival created a personality type obsessed with learning and understanding. Their experience of persecution and marginalization generated both deep empathy for human suffering and determination to transcend the limitations imposed by prejudice and ignorance. Most crucially, their intellectual heritage fostered skills in abstract thinking, mathematical analysis, and conceptual innovation, which would prove essential to revolutionary scientific achievement. The family's experience of existing between different cultures provided perspective on the relative nature of social conventions and the possibility of thinking beyond established boundaries. Their tradition of Talmudic scholarship, with its emphasis on logical analysis and systematic argumentation, created cognitive patterns that were ideally suited to theoretical physics. The historical timing was perfect, a family shaped by centuries of Jewish intellectual tradition, arriving at scientific maturity during the revolutionary period of early 20th century physics. The personal became universal, as Albert's ancestral experience of marginalization and intellectual survival merged with the scientific opportunities created by quantum mechanics and relativity theory, enabling insights that would transform humanity's understanding of reality itself. Einstein's physical characteristics reflected his Ashkenazi Jewish heritage in ways that contemporaries frequently noted. Multiple accounts describe his distinctive appearance: curly hair, prominent nose, and expressive eyes that suggested Middle Eastern ancestry. His height and build were typical for Eastern European Jewish populations, demonstrating the genetic continuity that connected him to his ancestral communities despite centuries of diaspora existence. The psychological traits prove even more significant than physical characteristics. Multiple generations of Einstein ancestors showed patterns of intellectual curiosity, analytical thinking, and cultural adaptability that Albert inherited and amplified. The family's experience of marginalization developed psychological skills in questioning authority and thinking independently, which would prove crucial to revolutionary scientific achievement. Intelligence patterns in the family line show consistent trends toward abstract thinking and mathematical capability. Family records document ancestors who achieved success in commerce, scholarship, and intellectual pursuits that required sophisticated analytical skills. The tradition of Talmudic study created cognitive advantages in logical reasoning and systematic analysis that would prove crucial to Albert's later theoretical work. But perhaps most crucially, the family showed multi-generational patterns of intellectual independence and cultural skepticism that would prove decisive in enabling revolutionary scientific thinking. Each generation questioned conventional wisdom, adapted to new circumstances, and maintained intellectual curiosity despite external pressure and persecution. This psychological inheritance would prove crucial when Albert encountered the scientific orthodoxies that his theories would ultimately overthrow. Cultural transmission patterns reveal how Einstein's ancestral experience of Jewish intellectual tradition shaped his approach to scientific research. The family's tradition of Talmudic scholarship provided models for the kind of systematic analysis and logical argumentation that characterized Albert's theoretical work. Their experience of preserving knowledge despite persecution created an understanding of intellectual achievement as a form of cultural survival. Educational strategies passed down through generations created expertise in learning and teaching that Albert would apply to scientific communication. The family's experience of multilingual education enabled Albert's ability to communicate complex concepts across cultural boundaries. Most significantly, their tradition of questioning authority and seeking truth through intellectual investigation provided models for the kind of independent thinking that would enable revolutionary scientific discoveries. The family's commercial heritage created psychological attitudes toward innovation and risk-taking that would characterize Albert's approach to theoretical physics. Their ancestors had approached new territories and changing circumstances as intellectual challenges, adapting their thinking to match new realities while maintaining core principles. Albert would apply similar strategies to scientific problems, adapting his conceptual framework to match experimental evidence while maintaining commitment to mathematical elegance and logical consistency. Today, Einstein's bloodline continues through descendants who have maintained detailed genealogical records, confirming the family's complex Jewish heritage. Genetic analysis of Einstein's relatives continues to reveal markers consistent with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, supporting historical evidence of the family's intellectual and cultural background. Modern descendants include scientists, artists, and intellectuals who continue the family tradition of academic achievement and social contribution. Modern genetic studies of Ashkenazi Jewish populations provide increasing evidence for the genetic and cultural factors that may have contributed to disproportionate Jewish achievement in intellectual fields. While environmental and cultural factors remain the primary explanations, recent research suggests possible genetic advantages in specific cognitive capabilities that may have emerged from the unique evolutionary pressures faced by Jewish diaspora communities. Understanding Einstein's ancestry illuminates how ancestral experiences of intellectual survival and cultural preservation shaped the psychological foundations that enabled revolutionary scientific achievement. His family history reveals how Jewish intellectual tradition, with its emphasis on learning, questioning, and logical analysis, could produce the mental framework for theoretical breakthrough when combined with modern scientific opportunity and institutional support. The genealogical record demonstrates how multi-generational experience of marginalization and intellectual resilience created psychological advantages that would prove decisive in Einstein's ability to think beyond conventional scientific boundaries. His family's ancestral experience of preserving knowledge despite persecution provided cultural models for the kind of independent thinking that enabled his revolutionary insights into the nature of space, time, and reality. Most importantly, Einstein's true family secret wasn't German Jewish identity, commercial origins, or intellectual heritage. It was that his family embodied the cosmopolitan learning tradition that his scientific work would exemplify, a tradition that transcended national boundaries, questioned conventional wisdom, and sought universal truths through rigorous intellectual investigation. The man who discovered the fundamental laws governing space and time was himself the product of precisely the kind of intellectual curiosity and cultural flexibility that had enabled his people's survival across centuries of persecution and displacement. In revolutionizing physics, Einstein was ultimately fulfilling the intellectual heritage that had shaped his family for 12 generations. His theories represented the triumph of the questioning, analytical, universalist tradition that his ancestors had preserved through centuries of marginalization and persecution. The irony is complete. The refugee scientist who fled Nazi Germany embodied the very intellectual traditions that made the Jewish contribution to human civilization so extraordinary, traditions that his persecutors sought to destroy, but which his achievements would preserve for all humanity.